Do you remember the first time you picked up a controller? That feeling of not exactly knowing the ins and outs of a game, and just screwing around and doing whatever you wanted. Looking at these off-screen areas and wondering what the heck lies beyond them. Really trying your best to take in every single element of this brand new experience. Then, as you get more and more into the hobby, you start to search for other people who like the same things. Or maybe those are the people that got you into it in the first place. Either way, this will usually lead to people recommending new things to try out. And I'd say that hobbies such as anime and manga aren't much different in this regard. While I do have my issues with recommendations and the community that I'll get into a bit later, I'm definitely not immune to this. Many of the things I've checked out because my friends like them. One such manga was none other than Gameboo, or Game Club in English. A 12-volume doujinshi, or self-published work, by Mozou Crystal. Not to be confused with a completely different manga, also called Gameboo. I looked at this and I said to myself, hey, I like games, I like booze, why not? The story of Gameboo, on the surface, looks to be about a game club both playing and creating games. And to some extent, that's certainly the case. The readers are exposed to a lot of different types of games. Indie games, first-person shooters, role-playing games, side-scrollers, shmups, a Minecraft knockoff. And from that, we get an idea of what each of the characters value from games and their general tastes. I found it to be an extremely challenging work that has a lot to look at, and it made me just want to read every detail to figure out as much as I could about these characters. Let's get into them, shall we? Our main character, Oka no Yukina, is the club president. She is someone who maybe isn't the most experienced player, but has a lot of motivation to try to make games, and dreams of becoming a developer one day. She doesn't really have any friends outside of the club. There are 2 girls she talks to in her class, but I wouldn't consider them friends since they often just gossip about her and take advantage by wanting her to do school assignments for them. I know that one of them is named Hikari, but I don't remember the other one even having a name, so there's that too. The other major character is Omotebayashi Tatakaobeshi, who is arguably Yukina's best friend. She's the youngest of 4 siblings, and her parents are actually Mexican immigrants. In fact, her mom can't speak any Japanese whatsoever. Everybody calls her Beshko for short, but it's interesting to note that the name Tatakaobeshi is actually Japanese for you must fight, and we'll see soon enough how that just so happens to fit her personality in the story. Unlike Yukina, she's extremely well-versed in games, having started back when she was a little kid. But also, Beshko is super interested in trying to break a game. She loves trying to explore every single nook and cranny, and trying to figure out all of the different crazy glitches. So with that, it gives her a bit more of an in-depth knowledge on how certain games function. Her playstyle also often involves skipping the text and trying to make her own narrative out of the game based upon the aesthetics and the mechanics. So in that sense, there are also certain parts of the game Beshko will just discard outright and not try to understand really at all. Whereas I think that Yukina, while a lot less experienced, when a game really speaks to her, she tries to understand the narrative as thoroughly as possible, and that use of a strong narrative shows up in the games she makes. Like how she came up with this insane amount of in-depth lore for Netherstone, which was just a simple puzzle game. So I remember Patrick Galbraith, who, for those unfamiliar, is this prominent academic on anime, manga, and otaku subculture in Japan. Many years ago, he talked about these 2 different kinds of otaku. There's the older kind, who was much more interested in sort of going really into depth with a few works and trying to understand every little thing. And then on the other side of the spectrum, there were those who consume a bunch of different works, and from that are able to draw different through lines between all of them. Though in that context, I do want to specify he was talking more so about physical media consumption versus digital media consumption, so it wasn't quite the same thing that I'm talking about here. But even so, I'd still say this idea is relevant to Beshko, since to me she comes off as a bit of both. Beshko's creations, much like her character, I'd say they're very chaotic and sometimes unforgiving. It fits quite well with her fascination of trying to break a game and her appreciation of mechanics above all else. When making a game, they tend to leave the areas she develops for last due to how difficult they can be to play through. It kinda bears a resemblance to when Super Mario Maker came out and people would just design these ridiculous levels. For example, 𝐍𝐻𝐿's work on Angry Cookie King, you have this tedious path up, followed by a long drop down with 2 paths, one of which has a bunch of coins, so you'd think, oh, this is the one I should take, but it actually leads to spikes, whereas the other one with 0 coins is the path down. Then you get a path with enemies filled to the brim, throwing projectiles that you have to dodge, before you can jump up and finally defeat them, and then you can get to the end. While a level such as this can come together in an interesting way, I'd say it also can be a bit much, especially for me. I don't really like difficult games, personally. 𝐍𝐻𝐿 has a hard time staying focused, such as when she needs sweets to keep going, and sometimes it's best to just let her go off and play games on her own, rather than develop anything. This leads to a bit of a delineation between creator and consumer, where some people in the club are more interested in playing games rather than making games. I'd say 𝐍𝐻𝐿 is less of an extreme example since she does end up creating her own levels. Instead, Kai's character is pretty much the main example of this. Now, she's one of the senpai of the club, but she doesn't show up all that often. The reason being that since Yukina started spearheading the club, the atmosphere has changed a lot. Kai was a lot more interested in just hanging out and playing games, but now that it's become more and more about making games, she's not going to have a lot to do being there, so she doesn't really see the point in going. On the other side of the spectrum, I'd say that the vice president of the club, Kishida, is a lot more of a creator than a consumer. It feels like he spends a lot of time in the manga developing the games. For example, he pulled an all-nighter developing Escape from Mars that the club made together, even going as far as to sleep in the school. According to the Volume 9 description, he was brought into the club to straighten it up, and going through the story, that makes sense. He often just kind of fades into the background and plays more of a helpful role in the narrative, whether it be helping Yukina with the games, or trying to find digital organism games that appeal to Suwa, in spite of not knowing very many. Oyone could also be considered someone who plays more of a supporting role in the manga. He's very quick to weigh in his input on things, in particular his reluctance to let someone like Morishita in the club when they're known for their many incidents in school. But also, he has a very specific, weird relationship with Yukina, where he kind of acts as her servant, and does a lot of the tasks for her. Such as in Chapter 14, in which he's practically obeying her every command to the point where Suwa describes him as being like her slave. There are even rumors going around the school that she's using him. Now, as for who Suwa and Morishita are, I'll get to that in a bit. For now, though, I'd like to look at the club advisor, Sakane-sensei, who has this love for older games, and in part seems to run this club just as an excuse to show off his expansive library. He has a strong appreciation for the games the students make, because they have a similar feeling to those retro games that he has an affinity for. He has a bit of a laid-back attitude towards the club, basically giving his input, but not really acting overly authoritative about it. For example, he wanted Escape from Mars, which was one of the games they all developed together, to have a lot more weapons and to be a lot less luck-based. Or even just telling Kai to stop skipping club, but also, he doesn't really go out of his way to enforce that. Even so, he can still be very supportive, and if something serious were to happen, he would definitely try to help, and he does try to get them any game they'd request. So, he does look out for them in some capacity. There's also this mystery character, Yoshizaki. She's the other senpai of the group, but she hasn't been coming to school at all, let alone the club, so we won't see much of her just yet. Now, for the two major characters that I'd say drive a lot of the conflicts in the story, it's Morishita and Suwa, the newcomers of the club. They manage to be similar and yet different at the same time. Both are brought in due to making a scene in the classroom. With Suwa, it was him freaking out over the teacher taking his rubber duck, to the point where he makes up a story about how it reminds him of his dead sister. The duck actually reminds him of his dead pet bird, Junko, and he carries it around with him everywhere. Morishita, on the other hand, is brought to the club because of her freak out in gym class, where she karate chopped a bench in half. This is not really out of character for her, because she has a habit of being quite aggressive and snapping objects in half. At the same time, they have differing ideals that lead to them often clashing. Suwa has this idealism to him, where he believes that people can set aside their differences and just get along. This coincides with his love of objects, since he believes that if people took care of and just looked after objects, the world would be at peace. Morishita, oppositely, holds the belief that most people won't get along, and that there's no point forcing people to see eye to eye. But also, she has a very strong sense of justice, where she doesn't like people who are dishonest. This is reflected in the kind of art they both like. Although Suwa has a fascination with digital organism games, wherein you watch these societies form within these tiny boxes, he dislikes the fact that it reflects a system where people die out if they're in too close proximity with each other. Since in the game, if a box is completely surrounded by other filled boxes, it can no longer compete with resources. He would rather a game that reflects more so the idealistic attitude he holds about people. Suwa also really likes pet-raising games, since they bring a reminder of his dead bird. Morishita instead loves games that invoke chaos, death, and destruction. She wants a game that reflects the reality of human nature that she feels every day. This all comes to a head in one of the big scenes of the series. Before we continue, I just want to give a bit of a spoiler warning, as this is where the story really takes a drastic turn, so you might not want to know about this yet until you read the story yourself. After coming back from a movie date that Yukina sets up, Suwa and Morishita decide to talk a bit about Suwa's relationship with objects. Suwa's love of objects in part comes from the fact that he believes they're eternal. Any living creature one day will perish, and Suwa understood that after the death of his bird. Objects like the rubber duck he has will exist long after he's gone. Morishita feels the opposite. She thinks that objects will come and go, and that they can be easily disposed of. We see this throughout the story, like, for example, there was the scene of Suwa keeping pens that have run out of ink just because he feels bad for them. Morishita sees those pens just as junk to be destroyed once their purpose has been fulfilled. This belief culminates in Morishita doing the unthinkable. She wanted to prove to Suwa that his object isn't that important or that meaningful by throwing it straight into the lake, only to be proven wrong as Suwa drops into the water to go after it. Suwa tries even though he doesn't know how to swim. This completely changes the tone of the story into something a lot darker, as Morishita now is forced to face the consequences of her ideals. She thinks that she killed a man, but even when Suwa is found alive, that doesn't change the fact that the duck is still missing. She will spend the rest of the story looking for this duck in both high and low places, but to no avail. There's also another nuance to it, in that Morishita feels this action taken towards Suwa is an extension of how her personality pushes people away. There have been many people in her life that have tried reaching out to her, but each time it's put through her own filter of the truth. Morishita can't help but internalize everything rude that's been said about her, and think people aren't being genuine. As a result, she acts out in aggression trying to get the truth out of people. This instance with Suwa has a similar feeling, because I remember the first time I was reading it, it felt like they were starting to reach an impasse about how they aren't able to get along. Both him and her open up to each other, and initially, Suwa's hate for people is what Morishita perceives as honest, fitting her more cynical worldview. But when Suwa goes back to peace for objects and idealism, she immediately thinks it's a lie, and that's what sets things over the edge. What makes this interesting is that Morishita cares more about this duck than Suwa does past a certain point. If you take a look at Morishita's words, she often talks about how she'll never be able to move on from this, never able to recover. Yet, it was Suwa, on the other hand, that reluctantly apologized to Morishita and is recovering in the hospital. So, they weirdly managed to prove each other correct. The rubber duck fulfilled its purpose of providing Suwa with comfort during a hard time of losing a pet, but after it's gone, that's that. Objects are forever, though, in the sense that this rubber duck has forever left its impact on Morishita. Another idea explored in Gameboo which I really connected with is the nature of recommendations and how experiences influence taste. This comes up in a pivotal part of the story, when we find out that Beshiko's actually played Yukina's favorite game, Night of Madness. Often there's this desire to share things you love with friends, both so that they can enjoy it, but also so that they can understand more about you. However, in this instance, I can't say it really worked out. 𝐍𝐄 dropped the game due to finding it too wordy and too hard to follow. She claims to have been addicted to a different game, Maghreb, at the time. However, considering she has a habit of skipping text in games, I feel like it's just not her kind of game in general. Because of this, Yukina's a little disappointed, and she doesn't really talk much about the game anymore. This scene reminds me of the many times people have tried something out just because I like it, and then they both don't enjoy it whatsoever, and don't get why I like it so much. When that happens, I'd prefer not to bring it up at all, because not only does it remind me that they wasted their time on something they didn't enjoy because of me, but also, I would just rather talk with them about something they actually like. Though, when they inquire Yukina on how she felt about it, another factor comes into play. Yukina mentions how, compared to 𝐍𝐄, she hasn't been playing games as long. After all, 𝐍𝐄's been playing games since she was 6 years old, and she's tried out tons and tons of different titles. In that sense, Night of Madness wouldn't be anything too special to 𝐍𝐄, since it's just one game out of many. Whereas for Yukina, this game was a pivotal experience for her early on in getting into games. Quite often, when you've consumed so much in one form of media, it can be a lot harder to form that kind of personal connection with something, because you've spread your attention across so many different things. But more than that, I think it showcases how the specific experience with the work can influence how you feel about it. Like, maybe they both played the same game, and there might be a lot of qualities to appreciate in it, but it's going to be hard to have that same attachment that Yukina had. Her absolutely brutal living situation, which we'll get to more of in a bit, is part of what made that game even better to play, outside of just the game itself. 𝐍𝐄 can't feel that same set of emotions for this game because those weren't her experiences. And you can see that 𝐍𝐄 going back to playing it with Morishita and Suwa later on in the story also gave a very different experience. They were going into it trying to understand Yukina better, and trying to figure out what about the game may have resonated with her. It still wasn't the kind of emotional connection that Yukina had, but there was some interest in appreciating what the game had to offer, even if they still didn't quite understand the story of the game, or even Yukina herself by the end of playing it. So tangentially related to that, another theme in the story is the relationship between both reality and games. This is initially brought up when Yukina talks about the fact that her parents just threw out all of her games without asking her, because they thought that games were a bad influence on a child's development. She uses the school shooter analogy, where one could say that depending on the outcome of the game, it could influence what actions the shooter takes. If the game gives him hope, he might hesitate. If the game has a tragic ending where only innocent lives are lost, and the bullies don't even show up, with nothing he does leaving any impact, he might not bother at all. So, what would he do exactly if the ending tells him to shoot? Yukina closes this by saying that taking someone's games away without them having any say in it, that completely takes the choice away from the player. Video games, like any art form, undeniably convey a message to the player, and whatever the player does with that message is up to them. But Yukina believes that games are mimicking reality, rather than the other way around. So, whatever decision the shooter makes, it's ultimately a reflection of his reality that he sees within this game. We also see this separation between games and reality when it comes to Morishita. She enjoys playing these very violent, very blunt types of games. And that's reflected within her aggressive personality, but she knows all too well that games and reality are two separate things. In order to exist in this society, it's extremely important to not mistake the two. You can say that Night of Madness has a similar impact to Yukina. It's this dark, gory, abrasive game, with characters that are missing limbs, some of whom aren't even human, and all of the playable characters are presumed to have died already. Whoever you choose, though, becomes the titular Night of Madness. The setting itself is rather sterile and just plain trippy, almost like a nightmare, with the Mad Moon watching over the world menacingly, and the tavern acting as this weird spawning point in the afterlife. It's kind of unclear whether or not you can even talk with certain NPCs, because sometimes when you press a button, that just instantly kills them in gruesome ways. The dialogue itself, I'll admit, it's pretty difficult to understand. You really gotta look through every single nook and cranny of the game to piece together each part of the narrative. Even so, such a depressing and perplexing work somehow or other managed to cheer Yukina up, because it reflected a reality that Yukina felt she was living at that point in her life. We also start to see the limit that games can have on reality, with Yukina's big scene in Volume 10 after Suwa falls into the river being the main showcase of this. She tries to distract herself by playing games again. After all, it was games that got her through such a poor situation at home with her parents fighting constantly. They helped her during a time where she was literally eating cup ramen for dinner every night. But they aren't helping her right now. No matter how much she tries to force it, the anxiety Yukina is feeling just doesn't go away. So when you're in such a stressful situation, sometimes it's so bad that not even something like games can really help you through it. So I'd say one of the major points of Game Boo is trying to figure out who exactly this Yukina character is. After all, the hairpin she has, the Mad Moon from Night of Madness, only allows you to see one side, and you can't tell its expression from the far side. Much like how, with Yukina herself, you can only see one side of her. There's this clear mysteriousness she has, but at the same time, Yukina treats it as if there's not too much beyond the surface. As Yukina says, how she acts in the club is just how she is for 90% of the time. But what about that other 10%? Throughout the work, it manages to plant these little seeds of doubt that kind of make you want to look at each interaction and really figure out who exactly is this character. Why did Yukina call games a nightmare? Why did Yukina try to create a killing machine? What situation led her to picking up a knife with the intent to kill? These unsolved mysteries culminate into a conclusion that can feel very cold at first. Morishita and Suwa's conflict with each other feels kind of unresolved. We don't get to see much of that finished game that they've been working on throughout most of the story. We don't even know if they ever return to the club or not, though it seems like Yukina at the very least expects to see Suwa again after he leaves from the hospital. But all we really get is Yukina and 𝐍𝐒𝐄 playing games together like they did at the very start of the story, and Yukina saying, "I thought my everyday life would never return, but it continues on." So what was the point of it all? After discussion with friends who have read it, as well as rereading the work myself, I've come to better understand who exactly Yukina is. The key term in all of this is everyday life, and once you pay attention to it, it's very hard to ignore. In essence, Yukina is concerned with maintaining a sense of everyday, and she'll do anything to keep it going with the people she's utterly fascinated by. Yukina's inspiration in this comes from, well,
game theory.
In Chapter 11, she describes it as seeing a situation and trying to find the best course of action for the ideal outcome. The initial context of this is for the game they're developing, but you can see it in how she approaches the relationship between Suwa and Morishita. Take a look at how Yukina tries to set up these movie dates. In part, it's for work reasons, since Yukina's very dedicated to creating games, and these dates help find inspiration, but I also see it as her own kind of game logic way of keeping these relationships together and finding ways to keep them in the club. Especially since Morishita doesn't seem to mind going, at least as long as Yukina's the one that's paying for lunch anyway. She uses a bunch of different examples of game theory in the chapter, and each results in a tragic outcome. And the same can be said for use of game theory with Suwa and Morishita. In terms of the everyday life point, I also think it's worth looking back and rereading Volume 10, which is where Yukina's panicking all night about if Suwa is alive or not. At first read, it's easy to see this all as just genuine concern for Suwa, but you can see she often mentions how this is going to mean the end of the club, thus her everyday life being upended. There's definitely a self-awareness present with the club members about how commanding Yukina is, and how 𝐍𝐒𝐄 and Oyone basically do her bidding. And yet, they still can't help but follow Yukina. A number of times in the work, we're shown how much pull she has. When they're brainstorming different ideas for the project, The one that gets the main focus is Morishita's idea about a post-apocalyptic RPG, in part because Yukina likes the idea. She even evasively writes Suwa's idea in really tiny letters on the board, kind of deceptively showing which ideas she doesn't like. Even later on in the game's development, when coming up with the story, Morishita or Suwa will come up with a vague idea, and then Yukina will turn it into a more elaborate plot point. Like how Suwa was having a hard time coming up with a reason for why the snakes become extinct, other than a threat shows up. And then Yukina swoops in and makes it a whole story about how the deer men outnumbered the snakes, and then started encroaching on their space until the snakes quietly went extinct. Which, now that I think about it as I'm recording this, it's an awful lot like those digital organism games they were playing early on in the story, huh? Or even the fact that Kishida made a world map that resembled Japan, and then Yukina took it, and she changed the progression up in terms of what direction the characters move from across the map, just to make the game's world map a bit more interesting to go through. This continues on into the mystery surrounding Yukina, and how Morishita, the person who always thinks of others as being dishonest towards her, actually believes all of what Yukina says to be true. I suspect that may be due to what Oyone said about Yukina initially being more like Morishita. Suwa, the one who's trying a lot harder to unravel this truth, he's a bit too afraid of rocking the boat, and so he just ends up folding to Yukina. We see this especially when he's in the hospital, and he apologizes to Morishita anyway, in spite of him feeling that he didn't need to apologize for anything, considering it was Morishita who hurt him, not the other way around. This was something Yukina simply wanted Suwa to do, just so that Morishita could join the club again. Now, the last chapter of Game Boo shows the return of our mystery character, that's right, the one I mentioned earlier, Yoshizaki, who quit school to work on her game. She comes back and acts really abrasive to Yukina, and is the kind of personality who doesn't want to compromise to Yukina's wishes. And still, she shows up to the club and decides to make a game with the rest of the team. Yeah, it's being done under the pretense that Yoshizaki's in charge, but even when it feels like Yukina isn't in charge, where you have the strong creative personality like Yoshizaki, it still feels like Yukina won out between the two because she gets to keep the club going, and they get to make a game together. I'd say when it comes down to it, even if Yukina's a bit conniving, I can't deny she's a real leader. Yukina has passion for what she does, and even with her managing these creative endeavors, they do end up with an actual project. Even if they aren't always fun to play due to her going against conventions in a way that might seem pointless, like by not having a scoring system in their puzzle game Netherstone. So perhaps in that sense, Yukina also gives them this consistent everyday with goals they can work together toward as a team. Though I've grown to understand Yukina's character more, much like pretty much every single title I cover on my channel, I still feel like there's a lot I don't know about the series. For example, there's the scene of Suwa at the hospital where Yukina convinces him to apologize to Morishita. She mentions that those who think of the happiness of others work their hardest and suffer the most out of everybody. When that happens, Suwa's thinking of somebody, and I can't figure out who exactly that's supposed to be. The character it most resembles is the senpai character, Kai, but if you look at how she's drawn, that character is missing the ahoge, and her hair is often a bit spikier. Furthermore, Suwa and Kai don't really interact much in the story, so I'm not sure how what Yukina is saying would make Suwa think of her. Considering the chapter before, Morishita thinks of people from her past, so is Suwa also doing the same here? Is this supposed to be his sister? I have no idea. If anybody has any clue, feel free to let me know, because I've asked multiple people about it, and none of us know who the heck this is. Whenever I'm deep diving into a work and I find myself trapped with all of these different mysteries, I try to look into what the creators had to say about it. But for Game Boo's author, Mozou Crystal, there's not a lot of information available online. There was apparently some kind of interview with them back in 2014 for Kamike, according to some random tweets, but what booklet this was in, and if I could even find it, are completely unknown to me. The only real forms of social media they have are their website and their Pixiv, which is pretty much only used to post new art on their Fanbox account. So that's when I decided to look at their other work, and looking at Mozou Crystal's other work, it's easy to see parallels between them and Game Boo. with the video game references in Kuroki Yodomi no Hedoro-san, to Spectra's attachment to her Zulu rabbit doll in Spectral Wizard, much like Suwa's attachment to his rubber duck in Game Boo. But the one common aspect I often see in their works is that they're left with a lot unsaid, and they can be quite depressing. Much like Game Boo, you're left asking what the point of it all was. One of their earliest works, 2006 Mission-chan no Daiboken, or Mission-chan's Big Adventure, is the most raw and unfiltered example of this. With its rough line work, strong use of colors, pixelated images, and an utterly dour premise of a girl taking her own life and then being forced to work these grueling tasks in the afterlife, almost as if being imprisoned. As a result of it being so dreary and depressing, it can be a bit harder to get into compared to the other works, which can have more lighthearted moments and a bit more of a varied cast. It's like if Yukina's favorite game, Night of Madness, was made into a manga. Heck, I'm still not sure if I really understand Mission-chan all that well myself. Game Boo manages to take a lot of these different elements that are in Mozou Crystal's other works, and create something that can be enjoyed on multiple different levels. It has its funny moments, the game concepts it explores are interesting, there's some focus on what it takes to develop a game, there are clashes of different ideals, it can get more dramatic, and it's also a lot longer than these other works, being 12 volumes long as opposed to most of the other ones being 1 to 2 volumes total. So, as an aside, I'm always a bit reluctant to bother creators about their work on social media. However, after reading Mozou Crystal's other stuff, I decided to be a bit daring and throw them a message on Pixiv. Let's look at the response I received, shall we? Well, it definitely speaks for itself. Perhaps my question wasn't very good. Maybe I should have written the question itself in Japanese, which I didn't. I only just thanked them for their manga and said that my Japanese was really bad. And so, because I didn't ask the actual question in Japanese, they flat out just skipped the parts in English? I have no idea. But honestly, what I'd like to believe is that they just chose not to answer my question. And perhaps that's all too fitting considering the kind of work Game Boo is. Just like I can't quite understand what Mozou Crystal's intentions were in responding in such a way, we don't fully understand everything about Game Boo, or about Yukina, or about the rest of its characters by the very end. We can try to make inferences about some things, but not everything's for certain. So in that way, maybe the answer I received was better than if I had gotten a more detailed one. And heck, I feel appreciative of the fact that I got a response at all. Now, I could go on about how you see the progression of the games they developed throughout the story, starting with a more simple solitaire game, then going to make a puzzle game, side-scrollers, a platformer, and eventually this decent-sized role-playing game. Or I could talk about how it's interesting that Volume 9 is titled Pre-Apocalypse, a bit of a double meaning considering they're developing a post-apocalyptic game, but also, this is the volume where Suwa jumps in the river for his duck. So we can consider this the end of Morishita's world in that her entire mindset completely changes. And it's also what feels like the end of Yukina's world, because she feels her seemingly endless everyday has just now ended. But the video's long enough as is. So thanks for watching. I know I don't usually do videos this long. Sources, as always, are in the description, including an incredibly well-made Spectral Wizard AMV that I think y'all should check out because it looked like it took them an absurd amount of time and effort to finish this thing. So, with all of that in mind, I'll catch you later.